This video is the essence of why history matters. With the current situation in the Middle East and the senseless killing that's been going on, first in Gaza and now in Lebanon, and the entire world is watching, waiting for the UN or for the West to intervene. But the thing is, this isn't the first time such a situation has happened. If you look into history, similar situations took place, first in 1994 in Rwanda, and then in 1995 in Bosnia. Now, just to be clear, in the case of Rwanda and Bosnia, the time periods were much shorter, and what's happening now is on a completely different scale and has been happening for a very, very long time. The reason I want to look into what happened during those two events is that that'll give us a very good idea of what will happen going forward, what we can expect from the UN and the West in general. And in this video, I'll be talking about the Bosnian genocide and the role that the UN played during all of that. And next week, we'll talk about Rwanda. Hi, my name is Misha and welcome to Tarihi Tales. So this is Yugoslavia, a country created at the end of the First World War. It went through a lot of name changes throughout its history and eventually it became a communist state. But still, for more than 40 years after that, different ethnic groups and different religious groups all lived together in that same area in harmony. But in the 1990s, the communist government started to fall. And with that, the provinces of Slovenia and Croatia declared independence. But eventually war broke out between Serbia and these newly created republics. Ethnic tensions rose quickly and people who had lived together as neighbors became enemies. Starting in 1992, Serbia set out to ethnically cleanse the Bosnian territory by systematically killing all the Bosnian Muslims who were known as Bosniaks. Serbia, together with ethnic Bosnian Serbs, joined together and used what was left of the Yugoslavian military equipment and attacked the Bosniaks. They surrounded the city of Sarajevo, which was the capital. Many Bosniaks were driven into concentration camps where women and girls were systematically raped and other civilians were tortured, starved, and brutally murdered. And as sad and horrific as the Bosnian genocide and the Rwandan genocide, which we'll talk about next week, are, what's even sadder is the fact that both of these took place when UN troops were there on the ground who could have helped. But what they did was pretty much quite the opposite. Now, what exactly did they do, right? So let's break it down. So firstly, what exactly is the UN? We're talking about the United Nations. Nowadays, it has so many different committees, so many different branches. But originally, when it was conceived at the end of the Second World War in 1945, it was meant as an organization whose job was to kind of uphold peace throughout the world. On their own website, they state, the United Nations, which it hoped would prevent another world war like the one they had just lived through. Now, reading that statement again, it makes you wonder whether they meant that preventing a war on European or American soil, but all other areas? Sure. Keep it up. And I'm not just saying this. Right after the end of the Second World War, the entire world was pushed into an era of deadly proxy wars, blatant wars like the Vietnam War, and US-backed dictatorships and random coups in so many different countries. And all of this wasn't just chance. This was all part of the Cold War, which was taking place between the US and the USSR. And the UN was actually used a number of times during the Cold War to legitimize certain wars, which basically means that they kind of justified a certain war. And these justifications were done in very shady ways. I'll maybe make more videos talking about those and the Cold War in the future. But for now, we head back to the 1990s, where the UN's inability as a peacekeeping force could not be clearer. Let's start with the Bosnian genocide. This is in no way a detailed video. I just gave you an overview of the Bosnian genocide. There was a lot more going on, a lot more nuances. But in this video, we want to focus on what the UN actually did, what their policies were. Now, in the case of Bosnia, as violence increased in the early 1990s in Yugoslavia, the UN actually implemented a number of different policies which were aimed at limiting the conflict. Firstly, in September 1991, the UN passed Resolution 713, which placed an arms embargo on the Yugoslavian territories. In 1992, the UN stationed a peacekeeping force called United Nations Protection Forces. Now, this was stationed in Bosnia and was aimed at preventing civilian casualties. And finally, the UN kind of pursued a negotiation process which it was hoping would kind of settle the warring parties and resolve the conflict. Now, all of these policies sound very good on paper, but in reality, they didn't make much of a difference, and some of them even heavily backfired. Like the arms embargo that the UN placed actually gave the Serbian aggressors a very, very big advantage because they already had the Yugoslavian military equipment. But now, what this did was that it kind of stopped the Bosniaks from getting any arms and made them an even easier target. They couldn't even defend themselves. Now remember, the Bosniaks are the Bosnian Muslims who were being targeted in this genocide. And a lot of researchers and historians actually talk about how this single policy really helped out the Serbs and really heightened the disadvantage that the Bosniaks were already at. Now, another issue with the UN's policy was that they wanted to appear neutral. They didn't want to look like they're taking sides. And the UN protection forces were given a very strict mandate to provide only military assistance for humanitarian missions. This mandate placed the UN protection forces in the impossible position of being a formally neutral force protecting the Bosniaks, which it clearly wasn't able to do because they had to look like they were neutral. So this also kind of shows the UN's reluctance to kind of step in and take action where it's needed against a specific disadvantaged group. They just let things happen. Now, the third policy, where they wanted to have these peace talks with the Serbs, also turned out to be quite a stupid policy because what they were actually doing was they're playing right into the Serbs' hands. Now, the Serbians would play along, they would look like they're cooperating, and they would just be buying time. They would basically be stalling the UN while on the ground, in reality, the genocide was going on full throttle. Now, even when the United Nations Protection Forces decided that, okay, we're going to take some action, it became so clear that they literally are incapable of it because they had a mission to basically create a no-fly zone over Bosnia. And they wanted to do this to kind of take away the military advantage that the Serbians had, an advantage which was given to them by the UN itself because of the arms embargo. Unfortunately, the thing was that the United Nations Protection Forces were too weak. The Serbs could easily come into the Bosnian airspace and they were constantly violating this no-fly zone, kind of showing that these protection forces literally could not stop them even if they wanted to. They were so unequipped or untrained. And there are reports from within the United Nations Protection Forces where the people talk about that when commanders called for air support, but whereas action could only be effective if taken within minutes, clearances took 6 hours. So you can clearly see how their methodology and their entire operation was very ineffective and badly led. In 1993, the United Nations declared Sarajevo, Goradez, and Srebrenica and other Muslim areas as safe havens. All of these areas were to be protected by the United Nations Protection Forces, and Muslims who would reside there or take shelter there would be kept safe. But the biggest failure that we see with the United Nations was the fact that they let Srebrenica be captured by the Serbs. And those Serbs then committed the largest massacre that was seen on European soil since the Second World War. These forces slaughtered more than 8,000 battle-aged men. They gang-raped thousands of women and girls, and one of the survivors of Srebrenica, called Hasan Nuhanovic, had this to say: "The Dutch peacekeepers just stood there, while the Serb soldiers pushed the men and boys away from their sisters, wives, and children. In fact, the Dutch were so keen on avoiding conflict that they decided to actually throw the Bosniaks out of their base in Srebrenica. The UN peacekeepers were supposed to protect the Bosniaks from the Serbs, but instead they pushed about 20,000 people outside the base, abandoning them to the Serbian soldiers." All of this happened in the safe area that was supposed to be Srebrenica, and it happened without the UN firing a single shot. They just stood there and watched. Now the question is, why wasn't the UN able to do much? And a lot of the answers lie in the way that the organization is actually structured. The United Nations is an organized political body of different sovereign states. It actually draws its power from all of these different nations and has no real power over them. So the UN's actions are kind of controlled by its own members, and the members themselves were not willing to commit resources or people to the cause in Bosnia or to even help out. A lot of historians actually talk about how up until this point it was the US which was kind of acting like a peacekeeping force throughout the world, which also a lot of other historians talk about how they were actually causing most of the wars. But in this case, in the case of Bosnia, and as we learn next week in the case of Rwanda, the US was basically the one that decided to step back and say that no, we're not going to be putting in any resources or any manpower into any of this. The excuse that they gave was that, well, we've been like a peacekeeping force throughout the Cold War, and we want Europe to kind of do its part and take up the baton and help out these people. But in reality, as I mentioned, the US was only doing things which were in their own interest and was actually causing more devastation than not. And even though they wanted the Europeans to step in, the Europeans were also not willing to do that. And they kept waiting for the Americans to step up. And they waited for more than 3 years. It was actually NATO and the US which stepped in and turned the tide of this war. But a lot of killing, a lot of bloodshed had already taken place, which could have been stopped at the very beginning, especially because the UN forces were there on the ground. They could have helped. In 1999, the UN itself released a report talking about its shortcomings, which took place during the fall of Srebrenica. They kind of used this example as a snapshot for both Bosnia and Rwanda and all the things that the UN itself had done wrong. The report admitted to a philosophy of neutrality and non-violence wholly unsuited to the conflict in Bosnia and criticized those who negotiated with Milosevic and Mladic rather than using military force in the war's early stages. The UN therefore made clear the inadequacy of its entire approach and the inadequacy of a system that allowed political considerations to color UN military decisions. Moving forward, the United Nations kind of made a commitment and they recognized that a deliberate and systematic attempt to terrorize, expel, or murder an entire people must be met decisively with all necessary means. But did the UN really learn from its mistakes? Next week, we'll talk about the Rwandan genocide, which started after the Bosnian genocide, and we'll see what the UN actually did in that. And I think it's safe to say that hoping that somebody else will intervene and do something for us or for people we care about is just simply a delusion. And that's why history is so important, because there are patterns and patterns keep repeating themselves, but we as humans keep forgetting them. I will see you guys next week. Let me know what you thought of this video. And if you liked it, please make sure to share, subscribe, and see you guys next time.